Okay, this is John Reed, Diginomica, and man, I am seriously on fumes, but that's okay because I got Josh Greenbaum who's on fumes too, and between the two of us, we could maybe be coherent.
Maybe, just maybe.
How we doing?
I'm okay. No, I mean, they're good fumes. Yeah, this was a good conference.
SAP Connect fumes, right?
Yeah, right.
The Global Maximus Flywheel event is almost over. So we're in the final afternoon. We'll explain that buzzword, by the way.
Yes, definitely.
And we are in my hotel room because it's the only quiet place we could find. But what we're here to do is to make sense of an event that was really ambitious in scope for SAP here at SAP Connect. And we want to talk about what went well, what didn't, and really what customers should take away, whether you were here or if you're not, you're like, what the hell happened? Well, we're going to tell you. I do want to open also by saying we recorded a live watch party and Josh joined me as well as Bonnie Tinder, and that is available on LinkedIn or you could ping me. So that was a live review of the opening Monday keynote, which feels like a lifetime ago now here on Wednesday. So Josh, in my last podcast with Brian Dennett, I gave a little bit of an overview of this event and why I cared about it. So I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to force you to do it. So Tell us about this event. You had some dialogue, as did I, with SAP before. Why were you interested in the event? And tell us, like, if you didn't come here, what was the big deal?
Yeah. Well, okay. Good basic starting point. The big deal is that SAP is really promoting a suite message that, to a certain extent, they're saying best of breed is dead. You want to go with a suite. SAP's got maybe, at one point, the term was best of suite. They've kind of pushed that aside. But the idea is that SAP's got this full panoply of functionality that is not just something that makes sense for a CIO, and we'll sort of put that in the S/4HANA BTP world, but makes sense for the line of business stakeholders and to help them achieve their business goals. And what's been abundantly clear at Sapphire, and certainly even more abundantly clear at TechEd, is that there's no major event that really talks the big story about how does SAP support all these different potential personas and business stakeholders. They've had traditionally Success Connect for the success factors folks. They've had Ariba Live for procurement. They've seriously lacked a supply chain event. They seriously lacked a CX event.
Though they occasionally did these CX Live one-off events, but
they did a couple of them.
They weren't really dedicated
insincerely,
events.
One of them will say. So here's this, they sort of set themselves up for this dilemma of we're talking this talk about suite and end-to-end process and process excellence and industry excellence, and we don't really have a venue for it. So the idea was to really, build out a conference based on 5 personas: finance, supply chain, CX, HR, and spend. Thank you. Gosh, back me up, bro. That's the fumes.
Absolutely.
That's the fumes talking.
Yeah.
And have essentially a keynote for each of them, a place to go for those stakeholders to gather together as a community, which is brilliant. And then to have breakouts along each of those different areas, but ideally to have cross-pollination of ideas, to have the CHRO, stopping by and looking at supply chain because that stuff matters, and supply chain folks are going to hang out with the CX folks because those two groups have to talk, and finance gets to talk with everybody, and start building that cross-pollination and that message around SAP can solve these end-to-end processes and they've got the product to do it. How'd I do?
Yeah, I like that. And we'll get deeper into how successful we thought that was or not and why. But what was sort of your initial take on that, like at the end of this show?
I think the general goal was achieved. I think we met some folks, and we'll talk about them, I think, in a minute, who sort of proved that point. Certainly, Mohammed's keynote on Monday afternoon was the keynote that talked about this whole strategy very well. I think Sebastian, sort of did a wrap up today on day 2.5, that kind of try to pull that all together. But I do say, my main disappointment is that, and I went to 3 of the individual LOB keynotes. I went to supply chain, I went to HR, and I went to spend, and really only in supply chain was this cross-pollination message really strong. I think the other two LOBs were much more focused on they were giving a keynote that you would have found at their home events and they both did have home events. That's Spend with Ariba Live and HR with Success Connect. They had home events once upon a time, and I think they gave keynotes that were like those home event ones, but this wasn't the place to do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that theme because that's sort of a crucial point around how well SAP did in this end-to-end thing and what the tensions were there. The other piece of it is that I think is really important is there was a fair amount of news announced, and a lot of this fits into the context where you could I use a cliche of double down, but SAP doubled down on the flywheel stuff from Sapphire. So whether you liked or didn't like the flywheel is not a one-off thing, folks. SAP is like really viewing that as a central differentiator. In other words, if they're serving this end-to-end vision, it's through this flywheel concept where you have data, apps, and AI embedded, etc., like kind of feeding each other, and that they're all interdependent. And this is like really core to SAP's so-called value proposition and differentiation in the market, where they're trying to say, you need all this stuff to get it right.
Right.
And if you don't have those three things, you won't get it right. And some of that is defensive positioning against the so-called SaaS or software is dead contingent, which I happen to powerfully disagree with anyway. But the point is, SAP is like trying to make this case and is trying to do it in the context. I think this was a really good event for it because the best way to make this case is with that end-to-end sort of view of things. And SAP is saying, this is how we're going to make a difference for you, our customers. And, exactly how customers get there and what that journey looks like is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah. And I think the other, one of the things that was mentioned rather often, and I think importantly so, was BDC and the data, the data strategy that's part of that flywheel really, I think was something that was brought home. And I sort of, when we did the watch party for Mohammed's keynote, he started out with telling a technology story, and I was sort of critical at the time, saying, we need to talk a business story. But the more I think about it, that's sort of nitpicking on the timing. The fact is that the data strategy around BDC is absolutely essential to everything. And really, I think it behooves the line of business leadership across the SAP ecosystem to try to understand it, even if they don't get deep in the weeds about what this really means. So, to know that there is a way using SAP technology where you're going to have your data accessible from everywhere possible, everywhere you need it to come from, SAP systems, non-SAP systems, structured, unstructured, and use that to drive both the application excellence that you need as well as the AI and analytical excellence. I think that story needed to be told. I'm glad that it was being told a lot, and it's a big part of that flywheel. It's very it is an important issue that needs a lot of daylight.
And there's a final piece of the puzzle, which is the changing world that we live in, and posing both whether you would call it a challenge / opportunity, whatever lingo, to SAP and many other vendors, right? Where it's, on the one hand, the risk management stuff is continuous now, right? Like, instead of preparing for black swan events, you're kind of thinking like, every day I need to be able to adapt to how things change, right? Like, maybe there's a different tariff imposed today. Maybe there's some fluctuation in some kind of regional regulatory policy that affects my business. The software of old can't cope with that. And so part of what SAP is trying to do here, and we'll see how successful they are, is to give you that framework where you can compete under the new terms, right? Whatever those, we're still trying to figure out exactly what those are, but there's no way you're going to do it with yesterday's approaches.
Absolutely. So. That being said, and this is, I think, I'm going to give SAP some credit. I'll give them a lot of credit at the sort of at the head of the company, where they're really starting to say, hey, we we want to support you in this complex world we live in, but we also understand more than we ever did that you have to have transformation at the pace that makes sense for you. So they've done a lot to really support that position, modifying RISE, putting a lot of technology on BTP, which makes it accessible in a hybrid environment. This is a very technical sort of detail that probably should have been told a little bit more strongly at this event, but you can really have it your way in SAP land. So you want the latest Ariba, it runs on BTP, and that will allow you
Which was a news announcement.
Yeah, which is one of the news announcements. They are finally upgraded. We'll get our snarky moment out of here. But you can run the latest Ariba, the latest supply chain, the latest business network, and still have some of your componentry living in an older ECC. And that's because of the not just the technology that, of course, BTP is part of, but it's also, frankly, a change in attitude by SAP that not everybody needs to be in the cloud or can be in the cloud tomorrow. Let's work with you, in a context that makes sense for your business.
Right. And I talked about this in more detail in my podcast with Brian Dennis. So I'm not going to redo all of this here, but I've been stomping on this access to innovation issue for a long time. And we've talked about how a good chunk of that was messaging more than technology. Some of it was technology, but some of it is just, look, you can use these tools. You can take BTP and start innovating with us today if you want to. And I think SAP is getting a bit stronger on that point, and it will be interesting to see how that carries over into tech ed. When we start getting into some of the reality checks around all of this, I think what's interesting is that customers, I don't think are all that, to say like, how were the line of business people talking to each other at this event? And then I think to myself, customers aren't that good at doing that when they're home.
Right.
Like those conversations aren't really happening the way they need to between whatever, your CFO, your manufacturing lead, your CHR. Those conversations aren't happening as much as they should anyway. So I think one of the challenges of this event that makes it hard is to start fostering those conversations and start opening people up to these bigger picture ideas and have new dialogue and bring those skills back into their organizations. And so that's part of the hard thing here, is that SAP has to contend with the fact that people aren't used to that in most companies, Yeah,
and yet here we are. So, I mean, Sebastian's keynote is a real good example. Sebastian pulled the 5, persona marketing leads out on stage and had them give their pitch. And so there you were. It didn't matter whether you were only here for supply chain, whether you were only going to go to the supply chain keynote and only go to supply chain sessions. You were going to hear what's happening in HR, what's happening in CX, what's happening in finance. You're going to at least get some of the language, some of the stories, some of the strategy. At a minimum, something will hopefully stick. And, maybe at that next water cooler conversation, when someone from another silo says something, you have something to say in response. Hey, I heard about that at an SAP conference. That may be overly optimistic, but I'd like to think some of those seeds were planted this week.
Yeah, and I would encourage folks to check out that opening keynote, and in particular, look at the Heartland Dental segment that I wrote about on Diginomica already. And I thought what was really striking about that was that they actually got the end-to-end fever through intelligent enterprise branding years ago at a Sapphire show. They talk about that.
Right.
And I found myself wondering, like, what if more organizations had done that? Because they went back from that and started working. It wasn't just a technology thing. It was the end-to-end process thinking that they brought back to their organization. And the speaker, he talked about how to be able to bring all the application data back into the organization and truly understand that data end to end, department by department, breaking down silos of data, silos of operation, thinking about putting all that data together and telling a different story. And then he says an end-to-end story that created massive value for our customer, which was the dentist. And then he goes on and talks about how a lot of the breakthroughs weren't even the ones they were expecting, but they had the opportunity to solve all kinds of different problems. And you think, like, if more organizations had done that, like, it could be a different story for a lot of companies today. And keep in mind, like, this is like pre-BDC. This is there's some AI probably in the mix in various applications, but this is not like all next gen stuff. This is just using good software to solve problems in your organization. And anyway, I thought that was really interesting. And I thought that was great that they led with that, because it really provokes, I think, the average customer to say, don't we need to get started on this? And this is not just an AI thing. I can't just go and buy an agent and solve this,
Yeah. And again, at least we're seeding these ideas. Hopefully we're doing more than that. And I think that that's a good example of why it makes sense. I think, there's certainly a lot of CIOs who understand this. I think, I don't know, I'm going to riff a little bit on supply chain, because I think one of the real, the most important moments, if you will, for Connect was the inauguration of a supply chain community that SAP has desperately lacked for years. And they haven't
surprisingly strong turnout from what I could tell.
Yes. Yeah. Sebastian in his keynote asked for folks to raise hands depending on which LOB they were part of. There was a huge, shout out from the supply chain folks who were still awake in the morning on Tuesday. On Wednesday, on Tuesday, I was at the supply chain keynote. It was standing room only. There was a lot of folks in there. And, the thing about supply chain, and in fact, I always say, if you want to find someone outside this office of the CIO who might be first to understand this end-to-end process problem, I think it's probably going to be a VP of supply chain. It might be a procurement VP as well, but mostly more, I think, someone doing direct supplies than indirect. And to a large extent, these VPs of supply chain, they're kind of a keystone persona. They really do, a lot spins off of them. They have a natural affinity lately, particularly the more advanced ones, to understanding CX, because they know they've got to deliver product to a customer. They're starting to understand, personnel problems and HR problems, because they know they have to have people in the factories and in distribution centers moving goods around. So I think this was really a big deal for me, and I was very happy to see that that there was a good turnout, and that SAP finally has this growing sense of a community around this important persona.
So let me talk about reality versus vision, because I think this is really interesting. I spoke with a number of customers, and one of the customers I talked with had a pretty cool Ariba story of really kind of re-envisioning how their supplier management and doing it at some scale, but kind of got into like some of the challenges, right? And he brought up like that it's really, really hard for our mom and pop suppliers to onboard with Ariba. They struggle with the user experience and this is like classic, right? This is right in your wheelhouse, and about the historical Ariba challenges. And one of the news from this event is the remade Ariba user experience. And so maybe finally that'll start to shift. But one of the things I said to Tasha Thurman is, like, when I evaluate vendors, I look at how the smaller companies do, because that's where the friction is, right?
Right.
And it's, and you're tempted to look at the big scale, but it's really the mom and pops, like this customer was saying. Once they're thrilled with Ariba, then everyone's going to be thrilled with Ariba, right? Or business network onboarding, or whatever it is. So I thought that was really interesting. So on the one hand, he's got this reality check, right? So we have this vision, but then wait, I can't onboard. And there's a lot of reality checks all over this vision. Like, I talked with Brian about the racy spreadsheet rise issue, where you're still stuck on a spreadsheet, like assigning roles
in a project, right? In a RISE project.
So there's stuff like that, right? That you could hone in on and say, wait, this is not in line with the vision that we're being presented with. But on the other hand, and I'll give you an interesting contrast from that same interview, I was really struck by this. We were asking this customer about the show, and he said, he had some good experiences at the show. And then he said, I asked him about the news, and he talked about, he liked the BTP news that you mentioned and stuff, and the business network on BTP as well. But then he said he really liked the customer engagement cloud news. Okay. And I was really struck by that, because I was like, that's the whole point of this show, in my opinion, right?
Yeah.
Like, like, here's a guy whose head's down on his, spend and supplier procurement issues, but he sees for himself what a difference that will make on top of everything else he's doing. He wouldn't directly be responsible for that, but he wants to get his colleagues involved in looking at that. And I was thinking, boom, like, like right in one interview, you have like both the reality check, but also the vision of this thing, which is like, yeah, this it opens my mind to new possibilities. And I was thinking that's what this show should be about, right?
Right. And and we saw that. I mean, that's what I liked about the supply chain keynote is it touched on those issues. It actually brought Dominic Metzger brought that point up. There was a nod to the fact that we need to think about this, even if it's not the thing we implemented. It's the thing that makes us look good, makes us important.
Should we talk about our show floor run-in? Because that was really
Oh,
interesting.
that's brilliant. Yeah. Why don't you give it a start?
Well, so we, Josh and I said, well, we got to hit the show floor because one of the things SAP was talking with us about before the show was how by industry we could start having some of this dialogue. And so we wanted to go down and get a feeling for some of the industry tours on the show floor. And so we hit that today. And it was really interesting. We ended up talking with an SAP lead on the manufacturing side, aerospace and defense as well, I think.
Aerospace for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And getting into that. And so we were asking, what was that like for customers? And he said they loved it. And we wanted more details. And then all of a sudden, a big SAP customer walks up to have more conversations with him. They're like five people.
Five of them. Yeah. A whole team. Yeah.
And they were good sports. And basically before they talked with him, they told us what they thought.
Yeah. And they, and so I checked their badges. They were here for supply chain.
Right.
That was their goal. And, and they said, and I think they were being honest and they were, very kind to really talk to us about it. Was, they were here to really solve the domain problems that matter to them today. But they did appreciate the opportunity that presented itself to understand where they can go with SAP beyond their domain because they know they're going to have to go there. Do you remember what that woman in particular asked? I mean, she mentioned something, I think, on the finance side.
Yeah, she was really interested in understanding more around how the finance management tools impacted her area, and she admitted like that's not my thing, but I want to get colleagues involved in that, and I want to learn more.
Yeah. So that was awesome part. And I'll say the other thing they said, was their only regret with the show was that they didn't get started on Monday with really understanding this big picture because here it was, Wednesday afternoon and they were like trying to hurry up and get a lot of questions answered because they had more questions. They were really, excited. I'll add something that they said just aside is that there's several layers down in the organization from the powers that be that negotiate directly with SAP. We got that straight. So it was interesting just see, here, these are folks who are real practitioners at rolling up their sleeves, doing the work. They're not in the office of the CIO. They're not, the VP of supply chain wasn't there. These are the folks that actually have to do the work. And they were getting a lot out of this conference. It was very impressive.
Yeah. And I think one of the really interesting things around this is how do you, the dilemma of the conference is kind of the dilemma of SAP in general. And the dilemma of the conference, to talk with a couple people at SAP about this, is you do have to have tracks for these people so that they can come back and bring the latest to their team. They're expected to do that. So you have to do that. So like an Ariba person needs to come back with more information on what other customers are doing with spend and what the impact of Ariba on BTP might be. They have to do that.
Yeah.
But the goal would be that you also open the mind and bring in new ideas like the customer engagement cloud example, and that becomes part of it too. And so the challenge for SAP is that they can't stir the pot so much that people can't bring the core stuff back with them. Right. And so one of the challenges is like people getting really curious. Oh, I really want to go. Some of the feedback I heard from SAP was folks saying, I really want to go to this HR session, but I know I have to go to this spend session because I have to do this for my project, but I really
Right.
want to be at this other place too. Those are good problems to have, I think. Like that shows me that this event is on the road to provoking the kind of conversations that I was hoping
Yeah.
to see. It's just that the reality check for me as an idealist in this is that I might want that beautiful cross line of business dialogue, but people are also here for their jobs
Right.
and they're here on a budget and they got to bring that stuff back. And so it's the balance between the two that has to get kind of figured out.
Yeah, I think there was a similar sort of tension and balance issue between AI and everything else. I mean, there was a
Yeah.
lot of talk, undoubtedly, about AI, about agentic AI in particular, about Joule as an orchestration tool. I think it was pretty well stated. I think, what SAP needed to say a little more strongly is that we're not just throwing you a bunch of AI tools that are pulling pulling out of these massive public large language models a bunch of stuff that could be hallucinatory or not. They actually build their AI tools, in particular their Joule orchestration, on industry best practices, on a fundamental understanding of what SAP is doing. And to a certain extent, that stuff's really important. Everyone is sent to every show, a tech show in every ecosystem and mandated to go find out what the vendor's doing about AI, because that's just, that hype cycle has just got everybody stirred up. But there was, I felt, a tension between what are you going to be able to do tomorrow and the next day with AI, and particularly agentic AI, versus how do I solve the problems of today? So, meeting this group of folks that we met, they were clearly not there to start, playing around with agentic AI. They were there because they had to migrate. It's an older company. They definitely had to be migrating from ECC and finding some new supply chain functionality. I think that was another tension that needs to be mentioned and acknowledged.
Yeah, I think so. And also just if there's podcast listeners that want more stuff on AI, just know that I write about AI a lot and I've written about SAP's AI strategy a lot. One of the reasons we're not talking about it a lot in this podcast is because I was really paying attention to where the projects are at on the ground this time around.
Right.
And right now the agentic AI adoption is still early, even though SAP announced a slew of new agents, et cetera. And I think the thing I would tell you as an example is I had an interview with PostNL, which is basically the Netherlands post office. It's a large organization, and they're one of the first customers at a big scale to work on the Explain My Pay with Joule, which is essentially sort of I guess you could say an agentic somewhat, or generative, however you want to describe it, but basically self-service for employees to ask questions about their pay and, the kind of payroll questions that you would generally have to revert to a human help desk. And it was really interesting to talk with the PostNL team about this. But just to give you a sense of it, they want to roll this out to 34,000 within maybe the next 6 months. But at the moment, it's a very small group that's rigorously testing this. And it was interesting to talk to this organization that's both being aggressive about adoption, but also being very careful. And they see the potential for it in this particular area because this is an example where talking to humans isn't always so great, because it's a little bit awkward to talk with other human beings about your payroll issues and
Right.
your finance sensitivities and stuff.
Yeah, your healthcare and your retirement.
So if you trust the bot, that the bot is being respectful of your privacy organizationally, and if it understands your concerns, there's a lot of good reasons why you might want to try that, as well as the fact that the service desk is not open 24/7, but you might have payroll questions 24/7. You might be obsessing about your finances on a Saturday night, and
you might be in the ER on a Saturday night and looking for a benefit.
Yeah, and using this type of thing, you can ask about that, and it's going to be really interesting to track the progress of projects like that. And talking with them was fascinating because I'll be writing about this, but we had a lot of back and forth around how accurate these solutions can be. And the company, the Netherlands company, feels very confident that they're going to get a good result with this. But part of this, of course, is that they're dealing with a very, very specialized AI architecture that SAP talks about, where it's really only sourcing their own documents, and it's also showing the documents that are being sourced, and you can look at it. And but I push back a little bit on some of that with the customer, because I was talking about how LLMs don't understand time or chronology, and so they might surface the wrong pay period, for example. And so we had a really good back and forth about that. And the gist of it is they're being very careful, and I think they will have some success with this. Exactly how that transpires, we'll find out in the months to come. But that's just an example of, I think that's a good example of where a fairly leading customer might be at the moment, which is starting to really look at promising use cases instead of just, throwing generative AI against the wall. But it's going to take some time to document how those work and what the advantages and pros and cons are. So that's kind of where I think this is at in the show.
I want to add that, Mohammed very particularly and several other folks very specifically were much more humble about where AI can take customers than I think almost any other vendor I've heard recently. And I think they're seeing, this is, the timing is good. There's been a backlash. One of their competitors got in a little trouble with some of their AI strategy, particularly in terms of their use of AI internally. And I think, this was a theme that came back several times. Again, Sebastian, I think, mentioned it, certainly Mohammed did to us in the analyst event, and then later in his keynote, that they really aren't, they're really cognizant of the fact that this stuff has to deliver value, and that they want AI, they want customers to approach it with that mindset as well. And I think that's very refreshing to me. I think it's the right way to go. I still would love them to differentiate different kinds of AI, because we're, collaborative supply chain is full of AI technology, I would say the least of which is probably generative. There's a tremendous amount of predictive and machine learning AI inside those tools. So, I like that approach. I think that made a lot of sense. I think it sounded good, and it sounded reasonable. It was a very practical view.
Yeah, and then, I did hear some stuff, around the whole, like, everything is changing vibe, and so there was still some of that as well.
Yeah.
But I think in general, like, it wasn't the only thing we were talking about here, and I think however you feel about the so-called flywheel, and we got to talk about the global maxima flywheel and explain that.
Yeah.
But however you feel about the flywheel, I think that I'm not super crazy about that, nor am I crazy, by the way, about the suite terminology. Although I kind of think suite as a service is sort of interesting when they use that, which they do occasionally, because this notion of consuming business processes as services, I think, is really kind of interesting. But in general, however you feel about that, it's basically SAP saying this is all important. Like, the data is important, and AI is important, and your apps and getting your apps right. It's all part of the same. And I think one reason why they may not be pushing AI quite as hard as some companies is because they're getting so much traction with BDC, which is really about solving a range of data problems. Because if you get BDC working properly for you, or whatever data platform equivalent you might have, but obviously SAP wants you to use BDC, but if you get that right, you can do all kinds of stuff, right? It's not, to your point around AI, you can enable agents with it, but you could also do old school analytics with that. You could do predictive modeling with that. You could use whatever technology you want, but the point is you've kind of started to solve those problems. And I think the light bulb's going off for SAP that really resonates with customers. And if they really care about data, that shows you that you shouldn't just be selling agentic, you should be selling the whole platform. And I think that's what they're trying to do.
And frankly, in terms of just a sort of kind of, I should put a market dominance play. I mean, if you can get the customers to buy into your data strategy, if SAP can get them to really look at BDC as the repository for the strategic data that's feeding applications and and AI and analytics and such, then that's a huge win right there.
It is, and SAP is feeling confident. They told us, I think it was Mohammed Alam that referred to BDC as the fastest growing SAP product I think, in a long time. I can't
Yeah,
remember what
he was pretty positive about that. I always sort of hesitate because
yeah,
that statement comes up
right.
often.
It does. It's funny how that does come
So
around.
we
Yeah,
want to
but
sort of see.
the point is they're feeling bullish about the
Yeah,
prospects of that, and I think that's no small thing when you think about all the different products in that category SAP has rolled out, and you have to take into account some customer fatigue around that as well. So the
right.
fact that customers are interested in that despite all the fatigue. One thing I do want to point out is that one of the crucial components to SAP being successful in this strategy is their insistence that you need a BDC type of environment to retain what they call the business context around data. And so this is a really big proof point that everyone should be keeping an eye on because frankly, there's a lot of vendors that can access SAP data through APIs of various kinds. And SAP is saying if you do that, you're going to lose a lot. You're going to be reconstructing a lot of data and you're going to lose a lot of connection points around processes. The market will decide and customers will decide because there's a whole lot of vendors that are saying we're going to be your interface into whatever it is, like financial planning or agentic AI or orchestration or whatever. SAP's not the only game in town. And so SAP's got a lot invested in this business context and providing superior business context. So let's see how they do. But one thing I did want to bring up, Josh, as far as like potential points of criticism that come up a lot, and I know you talk about this, I would like to hear more and seen more examples of non-SAP
Yep.
applications integrated into these workflows because SAP insists that it's possible and they do bring it up, but they never lead with it and they never show a specific product that they're integrating with. And I think at some point SAP has to suck it up and start showing integration demos with some of their biggest competitors as part of the landscape because that would show real confidence that you're the winning trusted partner and other people have to plug into you and here's how we do it. And so I still think SAP could do a lot better with that part of the story.
And and part of the story, and that BTP supports that story tremendously, and this is sort of one of the winning components of or the winning parts of the migration of Ariba to BTP, the business networks on BTP now, is that all the integration functionality that SAP possesses is now lives and breathes inside BTP. So anything that's connected in the BTP space can connect to anything, any application that SAP has that lives inside BTP. This means that, speaking of non-SAP data, I was talking to one of the execs today, and he mentioned in the business network context, they have Connexus customers.
Yep.
Connexus supply chain customers can use the business network. That's an important story. I wish they would yell that from the rooftop a little bit more because those customers don't have a business network they can get from a Connexus. It's great. Let them use that supply chain tool. If that's what they like, they should use it. But the many to many functionality of the business network, the supplier onboarding functionality, the back end and front end functions, that's valuable, and that would be a key selling point for SAP. If they were to say it a little bit louder.
Yeah, and I don't know why vendors are so afraid of this because when you have the trust and the partnership, you ultimately start taking over the application footprint also.
Yeah.
And like one of my favorite examples a few years ago that I really haven't seen since was a mid-market ERP vendor that even though they have a good CRM offering, they showed a demo with Salesforce. That took a lot of guts. But the whole point is you trust us, we'll plug into what you care about. You say you wanted this integration, here it is. And I loved it. And I thought the audience did too. And they're up front. We're going to keep telling you about our CRM and why you think you can get better value and better visibility, which is not unlike some of the CX messaging that SAP did at this show.
Right.
But the point is, if you want to plug it in, you can. And just to give you an illustration of that, I took the Commerce Cloud customer that we talked with today. We asked them about that, and they said we're using a bunch of different stuff besides SAP in the whole CX portfolio. But what he said was, over time, because there were a bunch of interesting CX product announcements at the show, including the loyalty,
right.
Which he was really interested in. And he said we're going to be looking to replace and add more SAP stuff over time. And the reason for that was the strength of the relationship and the value being delivered. So that's why I think vendors shouldn't be so skittish about this, because when you have that, eventually you start taking over the footprint, but it does you no good to say we can integrate with all kinds of stuff, but then it's more of an afterthought. I think you should lead with it more. So anyway,
I agree 100%.
that is what it is.
That's just, I think that's there's too much of a sales-driven culture in a lot of these vendors, or at least the sales-driven culture tends to dominate. And they're scared of saying that.
And SAP also, while we're kind of picking nits, SAP also did something else that I thought was a missed opportunity, which was they introduced a slew of new agents, including the performance, review scenario. And I said to a couple of the SuccessFactors folks, like, this is qualifies as high risk under the EU AI.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
And I know that you know about that act better than I do. And I know from talking to folks like Walter Sun, how hard you work on the ethics behind all of this. And I'm just really surprised that you didn't talk more about how you thought through this when you put this app out, and what it means, and how you thought through the risk components of this, and also how you help customers through that. And I think also along those lines, SAP didn't always feature the explainability components of their AI, which is usually done through a RAG type of context where you're sourcing different, here's where this came from.
Right. So, here's the provenance and here's the trust factor.
Yeah, here this performance review thing was compiled from these data sources, and here's the original links to the original things there. Why not show that? Because it is there. And I got good feedback from SAP on that, because they realized, like, yes, we know all this stuff. We just didn't put that into how we presented it in the keynotes and stuff. And my whole thing is, like, lead with that stuff and show that you care about those issues, because that builds the trust. And my thing on AI is, you want a customer's AI business, earn their trust,
right?
Answer their questions, show them you've thought about those things. And I think SAP will probably, I don't know if they'll take my advice on it, but I think they'll realize over time, like, we need to lead with that, because who's better than SAP on a global basis at risk management with various regulatory protocols? They're the best.
Yeah.
So lead with that. So that's
Mohammed did, to his credit, talk about that, and how, if you look at these agents and you don't want them to function autonomously, not in the beginning, because you want to build trust. Right. He mentioned that in his keynote, and he mentioned that at least once, and that, his vision is that the customers will use these and see how trustworthy they are, and see that 90% of the time they're producing or 90+% of the time they're producing the results they want. And and therefore eventually you'll be able to turn the switch and make it much more autonomous and feel like you can trust the outcome.
Well, we forgot to define the global maxima flywheel. We can't leave listeners hanging on that. So how would you define that?
Well, I think what Mohammed was really trying to say with this concept of global maxima and local minima.
Oh, local minima, right. Yeah, you don't want local minima.
Is that right now companies optimize towards what he calls a local minimum, which is basically, we're going to have the best, and this is his way to describe best of breed, that we have the best CX experience. That's the local maximum, if you will, for CX. We can have the best supply chain experience. We can have the best HR experience. But those are a collection of locally optimized, siloed functions, and they don't contribute optimally to the global maximum, to the company as a whole and its optimization. And that was, I hope I'm getting this right. I think I am. But the idea that he was really challenging attendees to look at the company as this collection of functions that need to be optimized in sync and simultaneously. And that's really that's the goal, not just to have the best CX, but to have the best company that's driving the best CX experience possible.
Right. Well, we didn't cover a lot of news from the show because there was a ton of news, but there's a whole news guide online you could check out. I've linked to it from my articles. We didn't get into the tool chain much, Josh, and I know there wasn't
a lot.
Not a whole lot,
about.
but I think we're going to be picking that up at Tech Ed at any rate.
Oh yeah.
And at SAP Connect. So let's plan on revisiting, because I like to have some back and forth on the state of the tool chain. I think that's important. But let's hold off on that for now. And you and I have a business case workshop to prepare for Tech Connect, which we talked about in a previous podcast, if you want to look for that. But we're going to be busy, man, because that's only a few weeks from now.
Yeah, that's coming up. That's going to be the next event the two of us will be hanging out at, and that's going to be exciting. We're going to do some interesting stuff there, and I think there's a nice momentum moving into sort of the Q4 here with this event, and Tech Ed in Berlin, Tech Connect in Louisville. I think there's a the doom and gloom story got told a few times from keynote says, hey, it's really, really bad out there. It's really scary. It's really, oh my God, this world is complicated. But the flip side of that was also being told very well, hey, we can help you. We have solutions that can help you manage this chaos, manage this complexity, do a better job. And I think pretty much every attendee I talked to felt that sense of optimism in a weird way. Like we're here because we can solve problems. And that's a great way to look at the world if you're SAP or one of SAP's investors for that matter.
So we'll shift from the line of business view on how to address these problems end to end to sort of the architectural piece on how to make it possible from a technical perspective. Yep. So that'll be interesting to fill in that gap. All right. Well, was there anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap?
I think we covered most of it. I'll just add one of the products that I'm excited about is logistics management, actually. That's a new product that they put together. They combined logistics and transportation into a single product, and warehouse management's all under that. That was just one of these consolidations that they did. They announced, and if you're in those worlds, that's big stuff. And it's also a sort of a keystone, if you will, kind of function. You can't be making anything if you can't deliver anything. You can't, and you can't. You got to get that part right too. So I was just interested in that. That was part of the supply chain keynote because I think that's another sort of milestone product for SAP. One day I'd like to see maybe an event more specific towards distribution and logistics, because that's something they do really well also.
After you left the show floor, I had an even more in-depth discussion for a little bit with smart recruiters, and that was a really interesting demo, and it was interesting to look at that. So there's a lot of stuff percolating in these different areas that we can't cover today, but those will be things to follow up on in terms of like SAP supposedly not into best of breed, but they buy a best of breed product, which they now have to integrate. But it's a really interesting product, and I think it's really cool to have both the talent and the automation conversation. And so Smart Recruiters provokes both conversations, but especially how do we get the right people and move past like brute force screening tools of the past. That's a topic for another time, and that's really it. So Josh, I'm just going to ask you as a quick wrap, what did you think? Was this a success for year one?
Absolutely. I think it was more successful than I anticipated. I think maybe even SAP anticipated. It really came together well. And, as I'm walking out the door today, several folks came up to me on the analyst relations side and said, hey, we got the announcement October 5th through 7th, 2026. We'll be back. They're not missing a beat here. This is going to have legs. And I think it was a good proof point today.
I think so. I think there's a lot that can be improved upon, but I thought the energy was palpable, and you could feel it. It was a much more of a bustling show in some ways than I was expecting for an inaugural show. So let's see how it unfolds. But thanks for helping me to break it down. I could not have done that on my own.
Well, thank you. It's been fun hanging out, and we'll be doing this again, obviously.
All right. See y'all soon.
All right. Thanks.